This is a review of the cardiovascular system. We'll start with an overview of the system. The cardiovascular system in humans is a closed system, meaning that the blood is contained always within vessels and the heart. So the cardiovascular system consists of the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. The heart is responsible for pumping the blood. This maintains the pressure gradient necessary for blood to circulate. Blood vessels allow blood to circulate to all parts of the body. The functions of blood, and therefore the functions of the cardiovascular system, are to deliver oxygen and nutrients out to the tissues and to remove carbon dioxide and other wastes from the tissues. Blood can be divided into two basic components. The first component is the plasma, which makes up about 55% of the blood volume. Of this amount, the plasma is 90% water. The remaining 10% is a mix of some major plasma proteins and other solutes. Plasma proteins include albumin, the most abundant plasma protein, along with fibrinogen, which is used to make clots, and globulins, which have a variety of functions. Other solutes include the ions or electrolytes, such as sodium and potassium, nutrients, such as sugars and amino acids, and waste products. The other main component of blood is the formed elements. Formed elements include the cellular elements, and they make up 45% of the volume of blood. The most abundant of the formed elements are the erythrocytes. These are the red blood cells, and their main function is to transport the respiratory gases, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Leukocytes are white blood cells, and they fight infection in various ways. The third type of formed element is called the platelet. Platelets are not entire cells, rather they are cell fragments, and their function is to stimulate clot formation. There are 5 basic types of leukocytes found circulating in the blood. Neutrophils are the most abundant type. This type of cell provides what we call the respiratory burst, which is the release of toxic chemicals that kills invading bacteria, infected cells, and nearby normal cells. Lymphocytes are the second most abundant. They form the specific immune response, such as producing antibodies. Monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils are all minor in terms of their percentages in the blood. Monocytes become macrophages and stimulate specific immunity. Eosinophils fight parasites, but they are also involved in allergies, and basophils secrete inflammatory chemicals. Here you see some images of the different kinds of formed elements. Here's a neutrophil, a lymphocyte, a monocyte, an eosinophil, and a basophil. Here's a field showing some platelets. In the background of all slides, these are the red blood cells. Let's talk about the heart. The heart is located in the thorax between the lungs in the region called the mediastinum. It sits in the inferior mediastinum because it rests on the diaphragm. The heart is oriented with its apex toward the left hip and its base pointing toward the right shoulder. The size of the heart is about the same as the size of your fist. Here in this diagram, you can see the apex of the heart pointing towards the left hip, the base of the heart pointing up towards the right shoulder, the heart resting on the diaphragm between the lungs in the inferior mediastinum. Here you see highlighted the names of the chambers of the heart. The 2 upper chambers are the atria. There is a right atrium and a left atrium. The lower chambers are the ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Notice that the apex of the heart consists only of the left ventricle. In this coronal or frontal section of the heart, we can see the interior features, and here we've highlighted the valves. The valves prevent backflow into the chambers of the heart. The atrioventricular valves on the left and right are identified because of the strings attached to them. The right AV valve is also called the tricuspid valve, and the left AV valve is also called the bicuspid valve. The two semilunar valves guard the exits from the ventricles. The pulmonary semilunar valve sits between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve sits between the left ventricle and the aorta. The right and left sides of the heart act as separate pumps, even though their beating is coordinated. The atria are classified as the receiving chamber. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circulation, and the left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circulation. The ventricles are the discharging chambers. The right ventricle pumps blood to the pulmonary circuit, and the left ventricle pumps blood to the systemic circuit. Since the left ventricle pumps blood to all the systemic vessels, it requires a higher pressure than the right ventricle, which pumps only to the lungs. So the left ventricle has a thicker wall than the right ventricle. The atrioventricular valves are easily distinguished because of the strings, which helps you tell them apart from the semilunar valves. We use color coding to differentiate the oxygenated blood from the deoxygenated blood. Since in the living tissue, oxygenated blood is a brighter red than deoxygenated blood, we typically color oxygenated blood, or the vessels that are carrying oxygenated blood, a red color. Because the veins, when you look at them through your skin, appear blue, we usually use blue to color the systemic veins, and in general, to identify the vessels containing deoxygenated blood. The blood itself, of course, is never blue. Because pulmonary vessels are the opposite of systemic vessels in terms of what type carry oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, we usually color pulmonary arteries blue and pulmonary veins red. The systemic circulation goes through all of the body systems except, of course, the pulmonary system. Blood flows from the left side of the heart through the body tissues and back to the right side of the heart through the systemic circulation. The pulmonary circulation carries blood to and from the lungs. Blood flows from the right side of the heart to the lungs and back to the left side of the heart. Here you see your circuits diagrammed. This is the right side of the heart. It pumps blood to the pulmonary circuit. It's colored blue because the blood is deoxygenated. As blood flows through the capillaries of the lungs, it picks up oxygen. Our oxygenated blood is color-coded red. It returns to the left atrium. From there it goes to the left ventricle. From there out the aorta and to the systemic circulation. As it passes through the capillaries of the systemic circulation, it drops off some of the oxygen it's carrying, becoming deoxygenated blood, color-coded blue. The deoxygenated blood returns through the vena cava to the right atrium, and now we've made a complete circuit. We're going to look next at the great vessels of the heart. These include the aorta, which is attached to the left ventricle, and the pulmonary arteries, which are attached to the right ventricle. Here you see the pulmonary trunk. A trunk is a very short vessel that ends almost immediately by branching into two pretty much equal branches. So the pulmonary trunk branches into a left pulmonary artery and a right pulmonary artery. Here is the aorta. Remember that the pulmonary trunk comes off the right ventricle and the aorta comes off the left ventricle. Major veins of the heart include the superior and inferior vena cava. These enter the right atrium, and the pulmonary veins, which enter the left atrium. So here you see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava entering into the right atrium, and 1, 2, 3, 4 pulmonary veins, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, joining into the left atrium. So if we follow the blood flow through the heart, let's start with the vena cava. The superior and inferior vena cava dump the blood into the right atrium. From the right atrium through the tricuspid valve, blood travels to the right ventricle. From there, blood leaves the heart as it passes through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk splits into right and left pulmonary arteries that carry blood to the lungs. All of that blood is deoxygenated. Oxygen is picked up and carbon dioxide is dropped off by blood in the lungs. Oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart through the 4 pulmonary veins. Blood enters the left atrium, travels through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, blood leaves the heart via the aortic, semilunar valve, and aorta. So here we can see again that we have the systemic circuit, blood returning from the pulmonary circuit to the left side of the heart, from the left ventricle out the aorta. These are the systemic arteries, systemic capillaries. Oxygen is dropped off. Here we are in the systemic veins, returning to the right side of the heart. The right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary circuit, the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, to the pulmonary capillaries where oxygen is picked up. From there to the pulmonary veins, back to the left side of the heart. So we need to distinguish the 3 different kinds of vessels. Arteries are vessels that carry blood away from the heart. That means they're carrying blood to the tissues. The smallest arteries are called arterioles, and they give rise to the capillaries. Capillaries are where exchange between tissues and blood will occur. And from the capillaries we go into the venous drainage, where the smallest veins, called venules, collect the blood from capillary beds and drain into veins. So veins carry blood back to the heart. Here you see a cross-sectional image and a photomicrograph of an artery and a vein. Notice that the artery wall is thicker, and very often it shows these folds on its inner surface because it has room to expand. The vein has a much thinner wall. Generally speaking, the diameter of the vein is larger than the diameter of the artery, although you can't see that in this particular case. Let's talk a little bit about blood pressure and the circulation of blood. Only arteries have high pressure, and that's because the heart is pumping the blood into the arteries. Capillaries, which receive the blood from small arteries called arterioles, have very thin walls, and they have a very low pressure as well. Veins have the lowest pressure, and they very often need the milking action of muscles to help move the blood back to the heart, particularly in the limbs. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It leaves from the left ventricle of the heart. It has 3 basic regions. The ascending aorta is only about 1 inch long and gives rise almost immediately to the aortic arch, which makes a hairpin turn as it arches to the left. The aortic arch ends by becoming the descending aorta, which has 2 regions, the thoracic aorta and the abdominal aorta. The boundary line between the thoracic aorta and the abdominal aorta is the diaphragm. So above the diaphragm, it's the thoracic aorta. Below the diaphragm, it's the abdominal aorta. Here in this diagram, you can see the ascending aorta, the aortic arch. The main vessels that come off the aortic arch include the brachiocephalic artery, the common carotid arteries, left and right, the subclavian arteries, left and right, the brachial artery, which ends at about the elbow, becoming the radial artery and ulnar artery. At the end of the abdominal aorta, it ends by branching into the 2 common iliac arteries. The common iliac arteries branch and change their names, and as they move into the thigh, they become the femoral arteries. In the leg, the femoral artery ends by branching into an anterior and posterior tibial artery. Now let's look at the veins. The superior and inferior vena cava enter the right atrium of the heart. The superior vena cava drains the head and arms. The inferior vena cava drains the lower body. So here you can see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The brachiocephalic vein drains the head and arm on each side. Here's the brachiocephalic vein. Its branches include the jugular vein and the subclavian vein. The subclavian vein becomes the axillary vein and brachial vein, which ends by branching into radial and ulnar veins. The inferior vena cava is formed by the joining of the common iliac veins. Again, in the thigh we see a femoral vein, and in the leg an anterior tibial vein and a posterior tibial vein. There are other veins, but the ones we're showing you are the ones that match the arteries we just looked at. Here we see the cat arteries and cat veins. You should be able to identify the aorta, the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava. Specifically, the thoracic aorta is behind the heart and can't easily be seen in this image. The abdominal aorta is below the diaphragm, and the heart sits right on top of the diaphragm, so everything you're seeing in this view is abdominal aorta. The renal arteries supply the kidneys. The femoral artery is going to be in the thigh. This concludes our review of the cardiovascular system.